The Senate chamber fell deadly silent as Senator Ted Cruz's voice echoed through the marble halls, his face red with anger as he pointed directly at Representative Jonathan Roumie. "You don't belong here," he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. The Texas senator had just done something unprecedented, publicly challenging a sitting congressman's right to participate in a joint session. But what happened next left every senator, reporter, and viewer across America completely speechless. Jonathan Roumie, the freshman representative from Texas, didn't back down. Instead, he delivered a response so powerful, so unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through the entire political establishment. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these jaw-dropping political moments that are reshaping America. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was the moment when the old guard of Washington learned that the new generation, even those from unconventional paths, won't be silenced, won't be intimidated, and definitely won't be told where they belong. The confrontation had been brewing for weeks. Cruz had been making increasingly pointed comments about inexperienced members, particularly those from outside traditional political circles, who dared to challenge veteran senators. Everyone in the political world knew he was targeting Roumie, whose articulate speeches about the foundational principles of democracy and voting access had been going viral on social media, earning millions of views and praise from a diverse range of community and civic leaders across the country. What made this confrontation even more explosive was the timing. The nation was watching as Congress debated fundamental questions about American democracy. Who gets to vote? Who gets to have a voice? And who gets to decide these crucial issues? The stakes couldn't have been higher, and both Cruz and Roumie knew that this moment would define not just their own careers, but the direction of American politics for years to come. Senator Ted Cruz, the 53-year-old conservative constitutionalist from Texas, had built his reputation on being a formidable voice in the Senate. Cruz had spent over a decade in Washington, challenging both parties with a fiercely principled approach, staging dramatic filibusters, and never backing down from a fight. His colleagues knew him as brilliant but combative, a man who could engage in unyielding rhetorical battle when he felt foundational principles were at stake. Cruz's political career had been built on his image as a staunch conservative, someone willing to challenge both establishment Democrats and even fellow Republicans when he perceived a deviation from core values. He'd gained national attention with his 21-hour filibuster opposing Obamacare, and his passionate speeches about constitutional fidelity and government overreach had made him a hero to conservative-minded voters across the country. But Cruz also had a reputation for a pointed, sometimes abrasive rhetorical style, and a tendency to frame political disagreements as fundamental clashes of principle that sometimes crossed the line of Senate decorum. At 53, Cruz represented a powerful segment of the old guard of Washington politics, a world where intellectual rigor and constitutional expertise commanded respect, where length of service translated to authority, and where newcomers were expected to defer to their elders, especially those with deeper legal backgrounds, regardless of the merit of their ideas. He'd grown accustomed to being seen as the preeminent constitutional scholar in the room, the one whose legal interpretations and political instincts were rarely questioned by colleagues or media alike. On the other side stood Representative Jonathan Roumie, just 49 years old, but already making waves as one of the most compelling and fearless voices in Congress. A renowned American actor who had, against all odds, won his seat representing a district in Texas. He had defeated established politicians who underestimated his intelligence, conviction, and deep connection with the American people. Unlike many freshman representatives who stay quiet their first term, Roumie had immediately positioned himself as a defender of foundational American values, speaking with a moral clarity that transcended typical political divides, and wasn't afraid to take on anyone, regardless of their seniority or political gravitas. Roumie's background was fundamentally different from most politicians in Washington. He'd honed his skills in storytelling and character portrayal, learning to connect with audiences on a profound human level. His path to Congress had been unconventional. He'd spent years studying humanity's great narratives and embodying figures of immense moral authority, a path that unexpectedly prepared him for the crucible of public service. This background had given him something that many politicians lacked: the ability to command attention, to articulate complex moral and constitutional principles with powerful rhetoric, and to remain remarkably calm when opponents tried to intimidate him. He'd navigated the pressures of high-stakes productions, intense public scrutiny, and the challenge of authentically conveying profound truths. In each case, he'd learned that authenticity and deep understanding of human motivation were great equalizers, that if you could speak to the heart of an issue and the conscience of the people, you could win regardless of an opponent's traditional advantages. What made Roumie particularly dangerous to establishment figures like Cruz was his complete lack of deference to traditional power structures. He didn't care about Senate traditions or unwritten rules about how freshman members were supposed to behave. He'd been elected to represent his constituents, not to be a quiet backbencher who waited years before being allowed to have meaningful input on important issues. The confrontation erupted during a rare joint session discussing federal voting rights legislation. For months, tensions had been building between progressive Democrats pushing for expanded voting access and conservative Republicans arguing for state control over elections and strict interpretation of federal authority. Cruz had been leading the opposition while Roumie had emerged as one of the most articulate defenders of federal voting protections, speaking to the moral imperative behind ensuring every citizen's right to vote. But this went deeper than policy disagreements. This was about power, respect, and who gets to have a voice in America's most exclusive political club. Cruz represented an established Washington power, accustomed to being the loudest and most intellectually dominant voice in any room. Roumie represented a new unconventional wave, a fresh perspective, and absolutely unwilling to be dismissed or ignored. The stakes couldn't have been higher. With cameras rolling and the nation watching, this confrontation would either establish Roumie as a force to be reckoned with or confirm Cruz's ability to intellectually intimidate newcomers into silence. The voting rights debate had become increasingly personal. In recent weeks, Cruz had been making pointed comments about unqualified newcomers who prioritized emotional appeals over sound constitutional principles, while Roumie had been delivering passionate, morally resonant speeches about the historical and moral struggle for voting access that were resonating with audiences far beyond the Capitol building. What made the tension even more explosive was the broader context of American politics. The country was deeply divided, and this debate over voting rights had become a symbol of that division. For conservatives like Cruz, federal voting rights legislation represented government overreach, an attempt to impose Washington's will on local communities that should have the right to govern themselves, and a departure from originalist constitutional interpretation. For progressives like Roumie, the issue was about basic fairness and equal access to democracy. He'd seen through his deep study of human experience and historical narratives how voting restrictions disproportionately affected marginalized communities and working-class Americans. To him, this wasn't about abstract constitutional principles alone. It was about whether America would live up to its promise of equal representation for all citizens, a promise he believed was at the heart of the Constitution's spirit. The personal animosity between Cruz and Roumie had been building for weeks. Cruz, accustomed to being seen as the Senate's preeminent constitutional expert and a master debater, was clearly frustrated by the attention Roumie's speeches were receiving. Roumie's ability to articulate complex constitutional and moral principles in ways that deeply resonated with ordinary Americans, often through compelling, heartfelt rhetoric, had made him a rising star in progressive circles. While Cruz's more academic and rigorously legalistic approach was struggling to compete for widespread public attention in the same way, Roumie, meanwhile, had grown tired of Cruz's intellectually condescending attitude toward newer members of Congress. He'd watched him dismiss the ideas of several freshman representatives with what he saw as barely disguised contempt for their lack of a traditional legal background or political seniority. As someone who'd spent his career giving voice to complex human narratives and advocating for the authentic stories of the underestimated, he recognized the pattern and was determined not to let it continue. For weeks leading up to this moment, Cruz had been making increasingly pointed comments about inexperienced members, especially those from non-legal backgrounds, trying to lecture their betters about constitutional law. Everyone knew he was targeting Roumie, who had been giving passionate, morally resonant speeches about voting rights that were going viral on social media. But Cruz's frustration went beyond simple policy disagreements. His staff later revealed that he'd been obsessively monitoring social media reactions to Roumie's speeches, growing increasingly agitated as his follower count climbed and his videos accumulated millions of views. Cruz, who had spent years cultivating his image as the Senate's premier constitutional scholar and a master of legal argument, was watching a freshman representative, an actor, capture the public's attention with arguments that challenged his core beliefs, often by appealing to a different kind of authority. The tension reached a breaking point during a closed-door Republican caucus meeting the week before the joint session. Several senators later reported that Cruz had launched into a biting tirade about grandstanding newcomers who prioritized celebrity over substance, making a mockery of serious constitutional debate. He'd specifically mentioned Roumie's recent appearance at a community outreach summit where he delivered a speech connecting foundational American ideals as to current legislative battles. He thinks because he can give a compelling performance for the public, he understands constitutional law, Cruz had reportedly said during the caucus meeting. Someone needs to put him in his place before he does real damage to serious policy discussions. Several Republican senators had tried to calm Cruz down, suggesting that engaging with Roumie would only elevate his profile further. But Cruz was adamant that Roumie's unconventional influence needed to be checked before he gained even more national attention. Roumie, meanwhile, had been preparing. As a master of narrative and a meticulous researcher of his roles, he knew how to build a compelling case, how to speak truth to power, and most importantly, how to stand his ground against bullies. His staff had noticed him staying late in the office, poring over Cruz's voting record, studying his past statements, and preparing for the confrontation everyone could see coming. His preparation wasn't random or reactive. Roumie had learned early in his career that the key to authentically portraying complex characters, and indeed to defeating opponents who tried to intimidate, was to know their arguments, their motivations, and their vulnerabilities better than they knew themselves. He'd spent hours reviewing Cruz's speeches about constitutional principles, looking for inconsistencies between his stated beliefs and his actual votes. What his staff found was revealing. Despite Cruz's reputation as a principled, conservative constitutionalist, his voting record showed numerous instances where he'd supported government intervention when it served certain conservative interests, while opposing it when it would benefit broader public good or progressive causes. This pattern of perceived inconsistency became the foundation of Roumie's preparation strategy. His communications team had also been monitoring the political landscape, recognizing that this confrontation could define his entire congressional career. If he backed down when challenged by Cruz, he'd be seen as another freshman who wilted under pressure. But if he could stand his ground and effectively counter his attacks, he'd establish himself as a formidable political force. The tension in Washington was electric. Political insiders were whispering about the inevitable clash between the veteran senator known for his fierce intellectual combativeness and the rookie representative, an actor-turned-politician who refused to be intimidated. Reporters were already preparing stories about the confrontation, knowing that it would likely produce memorable moments regardless of who came out on top. Lobbying groups on both sides were also paying attention. Civil rights organizations and interfaith alliances had been pushing their allies in Congress to be more aggressive in challenging opponents, while conservative groups were encouraging their supporters to take a harder line against what they saw as radical progressive overreach. Nobody knew exactly when the confrontation would happen, but everyone knew it was coming. The only question was whether Roumie would be ready for the full force of Cruz's intellectual might when he finally lost control of his temper. What nobody expected was just how devastating Roumie's response would be when Cruz finally crossed the line. His preparation, combined with his mastery of rhetoric, his deep understanding of human motivation, and his genuine passion for the issues at stake, had created a perfect storm that would leave Cruz completely unprepared for what was about to hit him. The joint session had started routinely enough. Senators and representatives filed into the chamber, taking their designated seats as the presiding officer called the session to order. The topic was the Freedom to Vote Act, legislation that would establish federal standards for voting access across all states. The chamber itself was imposing, high ceilings, marble columns, and the weight of American history pressing down on everyone present. For Roumie, walking into this room still felt surreal. Just 2 years earlier, he'd been performing on sets or engaging with communities, telling stories of profound human experience. Now he was preparing to debate constitutional law and fundamental American principles in the most powerful legislative body in the world. Cruz had been visibly agitated from the moment he entered the chamber. His aides later revealed he'd spent the morning reading social media posts praising Roumie's recent speeches, which had been viewed millions of times online. The Texas senator, accustomed to being the media's go-to conservative constitutional voice, was clearly frustrated by the attention this freshman representative, an actor no less, was receiving. The first sign of trouble came during opening remarks. When Roumie stood to present the Democratic position on voting rights, Cruz could be seen shaking his head dramatically, making exaggerated gestures of disbelief and whispering loudly to colleagues seated nearby. His behavior was unusual, even for someone known for pointed displays of intellectual disagreement. Several senators noticed Cruz's agitation, with some later describing his demeanor as surprisingly dismissive and bordering on inappropriate for the setting. Roumie, meanwhile, was delivering a carefully crafted presentation that combined historical context with profound moral and constitutional analysis. He spoke about the long struggle for voting rights in America, connecting the dots between past battles and current challenges. His presentation was compelling, combining lessons drawn from humanity's pursuit of justice and the spirit of the Constitution with broader principles of equality. The right to vote is not a privilege to be granted by states based on their political preferences, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, resonant and steady. It's a fundamental right protected by the Constitution, and Congress has not only the authority, but the moral and legal obligation to ensure that right is protected equally for all Americans. Cruz's reaction to this statement was immediate and visible. He slammed his hand on his desk, causing several nearby senators to look in his direction with concern. The sound echoed through the chamber, momentarily interrupting Roumie's presentation. The presiding officer tapped her gavel once, a gentle warning about maintaining decorum, but Cruz seemed oblivious to the warning, continuing to mutter under his breath and shake his head in increasingly dramatic fashion. As Roumie continued his presentation, Cruz's agitation grew more pronounced. He began making notes on a legal pad, writing so forcefully that the paper was visible, tearing under his pen. His face was beginning to flush red, a warning sign that anyone who'd served with him recognized immediately. 20 minutes into Roumie's presentation, Cruz couldn't contain himself any longer. He jumped to his feet, interrupting him mid-sentence with a point of order. "Madam Speaker," Cruz's voice boomed across the chamber, sharp and accusatory. "I object to the representative from Texas lecturing this body about constitutional law when he clearly doesn't grasp the fundamental principles of federalism and original intent." The chamber buzzed with tension. Interrupting another member's remarks was considered highly inappropriate, but Cruz wasn't finished. This is exactly the kind of grandstanding we've come to expect from members who care more about social media likes and public performance than actual governance and serious constitutional fidelity. Roumie paused, his hand tightening on the podium microphone. For a moment, the chamber held its collective breath. Would he back down as many freshman members might when challenged by a senior senator known for his intellectual prowess? Instead, he offered a slight, calm, confident smile, one that should have warned Cruz he was about to make a serious mistake. "Senator Cruz," he replied, his voice steady and clear, imbued with a quiet authority, "I appreciate your concern about constitutional law and original intent. Perhaps when I'm finished with my remarks, you could explain to this chamber why you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, while consistently claiming to support both voting access and the spirit of our founding document." The chamber erupted in whispers. Several Democratic members could be seen nodding approvingly, while Republicans looked uncomfortable, recognizing the precision of the challenge. Cruz's face began to redden further, a warning sign that anyone who'd served with him recognized immediately. What happened next revealed just how unprepared Cruz was for Roumie's direct challenge. Instead of addressing his question about his voting record, he doubled down on personal attacks, aiming for intellectual dismissal. The representative seems to think that because he can deliver a compelling performance, he understands complex constitutional issues that senators, many of whom are seasoned legal minds, have been grappling with for decades, Cruz shot back, his voice rising, laced with an almost academic disdain. This is exactly what's wrong with Washington. Inexperienced members, lacking a background in serious legal scholarship, thinking they can waltz in here and rewrite centuries of constitutional precedent based on sentiment. Now other members were taking notice. Senator after senator looked up from their papers, sensing that this exchange was spiraling beyond normal political discourse. The presiding officer tapped her gavel, calling for order, but both Cruz and Roumie ignored her. Roumie's response was surgical in its precision, delivered with the calm authority of a seasoned performer who knew his lines intimately. "Senator, I'm curious. When you say inexperienced members lacking a background in serious legal scholarship, are you referring to my years studying human nature and the pursuit of justice? My commitment to authentically representing the people who sent me? Or the fact that I meticulously research the impact and intent of every bill I vote on? Instead of merely engaging in rhetorical exercises or staging political theater. The thinly veiled reference to Cruz's famous filibusters, which critics often called grandstanding, landed like a physical blow. Several senators could be seen suppressing smiles while Cruz's face grew even redder. The intellectual combatant momentarily stunned. The final escalation came when Roumie began citing specific examples of Cruz's inconsistent voting record on civil rights and democratic access issues. With the precision of a master communicator who had immersed himself in the facts, he methodically dismantled Cruz's reputation as an unshakable, principled, conservative constitutionalist, showing how his votes often contradicted his public statements about federalism and individual liberty. In 2018, you voted against funding for election security, he continued, reading from his notes, his voice steady. In 20, you opposed the restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated individuals. In 20, you blocked legislation to protect poll workers from intimidation. So when you talk about protecting voting rights and constitutional principles, Senator Cruz, which voting rights exactly and which principles are you referring to? Is it the right to vote or the right to restrict voting? The chamber was now completely focused on this exchange. Staff members had stopped their conversations. Reporters were frantically taking notes, and other senators were watching with the fascination of spectators at a gladiator match. Cruz's hands were visibly shaking with anger, his intellectual composure cracking. His voice, when he responded, had lost all pretense of senatorial dignity, replaced by raw indignation. How dare you question my record? I've been fighting for constitutional principles and rigorous legal interpretation since before you even knew what the Constitution was, let alone how to correctly apply it. But Roumie wasn't done. Senator, I've been studying the human nature, the pursuit of justice, and the foundational ideals of this nation since I was a teenager, watching politicians like you promise change while voting to maintain a status quo that denies equal access to millions. The difference between us isn't experience, Senator. It's results, and a genuine commitment to the people over partisan dogma. That's when Cruz completely lost control. Standing up so quickly that his chair rolled backward, he pointed directly at Roumie, his face now purple with rage, his carefully cultivated intellectual demeanor entirely shattered. The words that came next would be replayed thousands of times across social media, analyzed by political commentators for weeks, and remembered as one of the most shocking breaches of Senate decorum in modern history. What Cruz screamed next wouldn't just end this particular debate. It would fundamentally change how both politicians were viewed by the American public and set up the most devastating political comeback in recent memory. The Senate chamber fell into complete silence as Ted Cruz lost every ounce of self-control and intellectual composure he'd spent years carefully cultivating. Standing behind his desk, face flushed red, hands trembling with rage, he unleashed the words that would define this moment in political history. "You don't belong here," Cruz screamed, his voice echoing off the marble columns. "You think because you got elected 5 minutes ago, a political novice, you can come into this chamber and lecture senators who've been rigorously defending the Constitution since before you were even a public figure. You don't belong here, and everyone in this room knows it." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Several senators sat back in shock, while others immediately began whispering to their colleagues. The presiding officer's gavel hit the podium repeatedly, but the damage was already done. For a moment, that felt like an eternity. Jonathan Roumie stood perfectly still at the podium. His expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't step backward, didn't show even a hint of the intimidation Cruz clearly expected to see. Instead, he did something that sent shockwaves through every person in that chamber and millions watching at home. He smiled. When Roumie finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and deadly precise, carrying a weight of moral authority that transcended the anger in the room. But what he said next didn't just respond to Cruz's attack. It completely dismantled everything Cruz thought he knew about power, privilege, and who belongs in the halls of American government. "Senator Cruz," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent chamber, resonating with a quiet power. "You just told me I don't belong here. You said everyone in this room knows it. Well, let me tell you who sent me here, and you can decide for yourself whether I belong." He paused, letting the tension build as every eye in the chamber fixed on him, sensing a profound rebuttal about to unfold. I was sent here by 189,000 voters in Texas's 30th district. Voters who were tired of being ignored, tired of being told their voices don't matter, tired of politicians who think experience means decades of maintaining the status quo while the problems facing our communities only get worse. You mentioned the Constitution, Senator. Let me remind you what Article 1, Section 2 says about who belongs in this chamber. It says nothing about law degrees from Harvard, nothing about how long you've been here. It simply says representatives are chosen by the people. Now he was hitting his stride, and Cruz, still standing, still red-faced, was beginning to look less confident, less intellectually assured. The same Constitution you claim to defend also says that Congress shall make no law denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the 15th Amendment, Senator. The very amendment you've voted to undermine 7 different times in your career through your votes against federal protections. The precision of his constitutional knowledge, interwoven with moral clarity, was stunning. This wasn't just a passionate response. It was a masterclass in American civics, delivered by someone who clearly understood the spirit and intent of the law better than the man who just tried to silence him. But Roumie's most powerful moment was yet to come. Looking directly at Cruz, who remained standing, but now seemed frozen in place, his intellectual fortress crumbling, he delivered the line that would be quoted in history books. You say I don't belong here, Senator Cruz, but let me ask you something. Do you belong here? The chamber went completely silent. Even the staff members stopped moving, because the people of Texas sent you here to represent their interests. But your voting record shows you voted against vital disaster relief for Texans after Hurricane Harvey and Winter Storm Uri. You voted against critical infrastructure funding that would fix Texas's crumbling electric grid and aging roads. You voted against healthcare funding that would provide relief to countless Texans struggling with medical debt. And now he was reading directly from prepared notes, demonstrating that this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a carefully researched dismantling of Cruz's entire political career, exposing a profound disconnect. In fact, Senator, by my count, you voted against Texas's direct needs more times than you voted for them. So if belonging here means truly representing the people who sent you, maybe the question isn't whether I belong. Maybe it's whether you do. The final devastating moment came when Roumie addressed Cruz's claim about constitutional principles. You mentioned defending constitutional principles, Senator. Let me share some of those principles with you. The Constitution says that all Americans are created equal. It says that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. It says that no one is above the law. He paused, letting each word sink in, the weight of history and civic duty palpable in his voice. Those aren't Republican principles or Democratic principles, Senator Cruz. Those are American principles born of a sacred covenant. And if you think I don't belong here because I'm fighting for those principles, fighting for the very soul of our democracy, then you don't understand what this institution is truly supposed to represent. The Democratic side of the chamber erupted in applause. Even some Republicans were nodding, clearly moved by the moral clarity and intellectual force of his response. Ted Cruz, still standing behind his desk, seemed to realize he'd made a catastrophic mistake. His face had gone from red to pale, and his hands, which had been shaking with anger moments before, now seemed to be trembling with the realization of what he'd done. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The man known for his lengthy filibusters, his relentless debating style, his ability to dominate any political conversation, had been rendered completely speechless by a freshman representative he tried to intellectually dismantle and intimidate. Finally, after what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, Cruz slowly sat back down, his eyes avoiding contact with anyone in the chamber, his posture conveying utter defeat. The presiding officer, who had been trying to restore order throughout the exchange, finally managed to speak. The representative from Texas has the floor. Instead of continuing with his original prepared remarks about voting rights, Roumie made a decision that showed his political instincts were as sharp as his mastery of communication and moral conviction. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think I've made my point about voting rights today. Not just the legal arguments, but the moral one, the human one. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the chamber. The question isn't who belongs in this chamber. The question is whether we're going to use our time here to serve the people who sent us, or to protect the privilege of those who think they deserve to be here more than others. He gathered his papers, looked one more time at Cruz, who was staring at his desk, seemingly deflated, and concluded, "I yield the remainder of my time." The chamber exploded. Democratic members were on their feet applauding. Even some Republicans were clapping, clearly impressed by the masterful way he'd handled the confrontation. Staff members throughout the chamber were frantically texting and making phone calls, knowing they'd just witnessed a defining moment in American politics. Ted Cruz sat motionless at his desk, the man who'd started this confrontation now looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. The freshman representative from Texas had just delivered one of the most devastating political responses in Senate history, and everyone in that chamber knew they'd witnessed something special. The moment Jonathan Roumie finished speaking, the political world exploded. Within minutes, video clips of the exchange were flooding social media platforms. The hashtag #YouDon'tBelongHere began trending on Twitter, but not in the way Ted Cruz had intended. Staff members in the chamber were frantically texting reporters, knowing they just witnessed a historic moment. The video of Cruz screaming, "You don't belong here," followed immediately by Roumie's devastating response, was being shared thousands of times per minute across every social media platform. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Cruz, red-faced and trembling with rage, pointing accusingly at a composed Roumie, followed by his calm, systematic destruction of Cruz's argument and his credibility. Twitter exploded with reactions from across the political spectrum. Progressive activists immediately began sharing clips with captions like, "This is what standing up to intellectual arrogance looks like," and "Freshman actor turned representative schools veteran, senator on the Constitution and the people's will." But the response wasn't limited to Democrats. Even some conservative commentators admitted that Cruz had gone too far. One prominent Republican strategist tweeted, "Ted Cruz just learned why you should never bring raw emotion to an intellectual and moral fight." Roumie was clearly prepared for this, with a different kind of script. The most viral moment was a side-by-side comparison showing Cruz's angry face contrasted with Roumie's calm smile, captioned, "When you try to intellectually dismantle an actor who spent his career embodying profound truths, but forget he's been authentically connecting with people his entire life." Memes began flooding the internet within hours. The image of Cruz pointing angrily while Roumie stood calmly became an instant template for discussions about privilege, power, authenticity, and who really belongs in positions of authority. News organizations that had barely covered Roumie before were suddenly scrambling to learn everything about the freshman representative who just delivered one of the most powerful political responses in recent memory. Cable news shows replayed the exchange throughout the evening. Political commentators analyzed every word, with most concluding that Roumie had delivered a masterclass in political communication, blending rhetorical power with unshakable moral conviction. One prominent political analyst summarized the moment. "What we saw today wasn't just a political response. It was a generational changing of the guard. The old model of intellectual intimidation and seniority-based respect just met the new model of authentic preparation, profound knowledge, and undeniable moral authority." Conservative media outlets found themselves in a difficult position. While many had initially supported Cruz's general opposition to federal voting rights legislation on constitutional grounds, his personal attack on Roumie was harder to defend. Several conservative commentators criticized Cruz's approach while praising Roumie's composure and articulate rebuttal. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed over 10 million times across all platforms. Roumie's social media following increased by over 200,000 followers in a single day. His campaign fundraising website crashed from traffic as donations poured in from across the country. Cruz's numbers told a different story. His social media mentions were overwhelmingly negative, with many calling for him to apologize. Several Texas newspapers ran editorials questioning whether his behavior was appropriate for someone representing their state, especially given his usual calls for civility and decorum. The confrontation immediately changed the dynamics in Washington. Democratic leadership, who had sometimes been cautious about elevating freshman members too quickly, began including Roumie in high-profile committee assignments and media appearances, recognizing his unique ability to connect with a broad public. Republican colleagues of Cruz's were privately critical of his outburst. Several senators were overheard saying that his behavior had made it harder for them to argue against voting rights legislation, since the conversation had shifted from policy details to questions about who deserves respect and true representation in American politics. Political insiders quickly realized that Roumie's response hadn't been spontaneous. his detailed knowledge of Cruz's voting record, his precise constitutional references, his prepared statistics about Cruz's positions on Texas issues. All of this suggested he'd been ready for exactly this confrontation. Later interviews revealed that Roumie's staff had indeed been preparing for weeks. "We knew Senator Cruz had a pattern of trying to intellectually dominate and intimidate members he disagreed with," one aide revealed. Representative Roumie decided that if Cruz wanted to make it personal and about who truly belongs, he would be ready with unassailable facts and moral clarity. This preparation transformed what could have been a moment of humiliation into a career-defining triumph. Instead of being remembered as the freshman who got shouted down by a veteran senator, Roumie became the representative who stood up to intellectual bullying and won decisively. The exchange resonated far beyond Washington politics. Countless individuals across the country shared stories about being told they didn't belong in various professional or civic settings, and saw in Roumie's response a powerful model for how to handle condescension and dismissiveness with dignity, intelligence, and moral conviction. Civil rights organizations and interfaith groups praised him for demonstrating that the new generation of political leaders, especially those from outside traditional pathways, wouldn't accept the dismissive treatment that previous generations had often been forced to endure. Educational institutions began using the exchange as a case study in effective political communication, showing how preparation, profound knowledge of foundational principles, and unshakable composure can overcome attempts at intellectual intimidation. In the weeks following the confrontation, Ted Cruz struggled to regain his footing. His attempts to clarify his comments, insisting his anger was about policy and a strict interpretation of the Constitution, not personal, only drew more attention to the original outburst. His office issued several statements trying to explain his position, but the stark video evidence of his rage made these explanations difficult to believe for many. Texas newspapers began running critical editorials about Cruz's behavior. Several called for him to issue a formal apology, noting that his conduct had reflected poorly on their state's reputation for serious, respectful debate. More damaging for Cruz was the way the incident affected his relationship with colleagues. Several senators privately expressed concern that his abrasive intellectual style and unyielding confrontational approach, now publicly seen to devolve into unparliamentary anger, made him a liability in important negotiations. The confrontation marked a clear turning point in how political power dynamics work in Washington. The traditional model, where seniority and perceived intellectual authority could silence opposition, had been challenged successfully by a new generation that was prepared, profoundly knowledgeable, and unafraid to speak truth to power from an unconventional platform. For Roumie, the moment launched him into national prominence. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. His policy positions on voting rights and the moral imperatives of democratic participation, which had been overlooked by national media before the confrontation, suddenly became topics of serious discussion. The incident also changed how other freshman members approached confrontations with senior colleagues. Several reported feeling more confident about challenging inappropriate or condescending behavior, knowing that deep preparation and a foundation of facts and moral conviction could overcome attempts at intimidation. Perhaps most importantly for Roumie's original purpose, the confrontation actually advanced the voting rights discussion he'd been trying to have. Cruz's outburst had shifted public attention to the underlying issues, and his inability to effectively defend his voting record had significantly weakened opposition arguments. Within weeks, several moderate senators who had been undecided on voting rights legislation announced their support, citing the need to ensure that all Americans have equal access to political participation as a moral and constitutional imperative. The confrontation between Ted Cruz and Jonathan Roumie represented something larger than a single political disagreement. It showcased the fundamental shift happening in American politics, where traditional power structures based on seniority and institutional authority are being challenged by a new generation armed with authentic knowledge, meticulous preparation, and profound moral clarity. The lesson for political observers was clear. In the modern political environment, the loudest or most academically aggressive voice doesn't always win. Sometimes the most authentically prepared and morally resonant voice does. For young Americans watching the exchange, Roumie's response provided a powerful example of how to stand up to intellectual bullying and dismissiveness. He didn't respond with anger or raw emotion. He responded with facts, profound constitutional knowledge, and unshakable confidence in his right and the right of the people he represented to be heard. As the dust settled from this political earthquake, one thing became crystal clear. Jonathan Roumie had not only proven he belonged in the halls of Congress, he demonstrated that he was exactly the kind of leader American democracy needs, especially in an era craving authenticity and moral grounding. His response to Ted Cruz's attack didn't just defend his own right to participate in American government. It defended the principle that in a democracy, power comes from the people, from the consent of the governed, not from those who think their intellect or tenure makes them inherently more deserving than others. The freshman representative from Texas, an actor who dared to step into the political arena, had walked into that chamber as a relative unknown in Washington's quarters of power. He left as a national political star who'd reminded America that sometimes the most powerful response to "you don't belong here" is simply proving, with quiet conviction, that you do. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown that's still sending shockwaves through Washington. If you enjoyed seeing how Jonathan Roumie turned the tables on Ted Cruz, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll be following up with more analysis of how this confrontation is changing politics in America. And you won't want to miss what happens next in this ongoing political drama. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when we drop the next explosive political story.